Hey everyone, happy Sunday. I am not live tonight because I am on the road, and instead I have an interview for you, the first ever Collapse Times interview with Brian Allemana. We're talking about the astrology of the Civil War. It's two white people talking about the astrology of the Civil War, so it might not be everybody's cup of tea, but if you're into kind of the nooks and crannies of mundane astrological events and the different layers that the astrology of the Civil War kind of describes, then you'll probably like it. And I hope you like the interview format in general, because I actually loved the experience of doing an interview, being an interviewer. And I hope to do more of those and maybe turn it into a podcast too, just record the audio. And I haven't looked into the intricacies of launching a podcast yet, but yeah, I have a couple guests in mind, and I hope to bring you more interviews in the future. So I hope you find this interesting. I hope you have a great Sunday. I will pull our cards for this week and post them either Sunday afternoon or Monday, and I will be back with y'all live next week.
All right. Well, everyone, welcome to the first ever Collapse Times interview. We're going to be interviewing Brian Alamina today. And mostly I'm going to just let you introduce yourself, Brian, but I'll just say that we met at the Revolution Rising Summit a couple weeks ago, about a month ago now, and we were on a round table together that focused on the astrology of the United States. So it was us, four other very interesting astrologers. Everyone has been doing their own research and diving into the Sibley chart and other things about the astrology of the United States. And this conversation is going to focus on the astrology of the Civil War and a lot of pretty deep research that Brian has been doing on that. So, yeah, Brian, if you want to just start by introducing yourself, maybe a little bit about how you came to astrology and maybe especially mundane astrology and kind of what your background and history is around that.
Yeah, sure. Happy to, Hummingbird. I'm really glad to be on the program here and to talk with you. I've really enjoyed getting to know your work, and so it's really a pleasure to be here with you today. Um, yeah, my name is Brian, and I'm an astrologer. I'm based in Asheville, North Carolina. I came here from Chicago, and I got my start as an astrologer in Chicago way back years ago. I've been a practicing astrologer for about 13 years. And I first got into astrology. I had a teacher in Chicago who felt that I might have a knack for it. And so he gave me some lessons initially. And his name was Guy Spiro. And then I discovered the work of Jeffrey Wolf Green in evolutionary astrology. And that really uh, sparked my interest and deepened my understanding of the symbolic language of astrology. And I studied evolutionary astrology and went through the program, one of the programs there, and th eventually started going to NORWAC, which is the conference out in the Seattle area every year. And while I was there, I took a workshop with Alan Oken. I got to know him, and I apprenticed with him for about 3 years. And working with him on natal astrology interpretation and also esoteric astrology or soul-centered astrology, which is an interesting kind of perspective on the symbols that's a bit different than the conventional way we think of astrology. Um, and I've also studied with Melanie Reinhardt, who's sort of the master of Chiron and has written some amazing
Mm.
books on understanding Chiron in the horoscope. And so it's kind of my background. I kind of blend a lot of different things together. My interest in mundane astrology actually came probably, for like a lot of astrologers, came through reading Richard Tarnas. I read Cosmos and Psyche, and it just blew my mind, and how thoroughly researched that book is, and how clearly he elucidates these astrological correlations with history. And so um, I got into that book and started looking into some things that were interesting to me. And I was particularly getting interested in American history, partly because I was concerned with where things are going here in the United States, politically, socially, culturally, And as I studied history and started to notice the astrological correlations, it really started to, I started to get really excited about that. So I've just been studying, bringing these two disciplines together. I do not consider myself a historian, but I do have a very much an interest in history, particularly American history, and bringing that study into or blending it with the study of astrology has just really been a fascinating and enriching practice. So, have I have spent some time studying the Civil War and the astrological alignments that were important during that time, and the natal charts of some of the important people during that time, and certainly discovered some interesting things that I'm sure we'll get to talk about. So, yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, I feel like mundane astrology is a branch of astrology where there is so much uncharted territory.
Hmm.
And the Civil War, this conversation might be an example of that. There is just so many different places you can go in history, and then so many like nooks and crannies of the astrology that you can get into. And your
Yeah.
series of articles brought to light a lot of pieces that I hadn't considered, even though I've looked a lot at like kind of the broad outer planet transits and as they relate to American history. But yeah, I'm
Yeah.
excited to get into more of the details of what was happening.
Yeah.
And, as most people listening to this probably know, maybe the main transit that we're talking about right now when it comes to the current astrology and the astrology of the Civil War is the Uranus return of the United States. We're coming up on the third one. The first one was happening right as the Civil War got started. And yeah, Brian has a series of articles that I think there's two parts out now, but there's maybe at least one other part that's on the way
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
might
I
be out
thought it
by the
was going to
time this is
be,
released. Go
yeah.
ahead.
Oh, yeah. Sorry. I was just going to say, I thought it was going to be two parts. Now it looks like it's going to be three. I'm hoping it doesn't go to four, although, I'm Gemini rising. I'm Mars and Gemini. So I just, once I start writing, sometimes I just keep going. But in any case, yes, thanks for mentioning that. I have a blog at soulriseastrology.com, and I have a couple of articles on the Civil War. And so, yeah, trying to put out there what I've learned.
Yeah, I've had that experience too of thinking something is going to be nice and
Yeah.
neatly summarized in one little batch of content, and then it becomes its own thing
Own
that has to go
series.
on and
Yeah.
on. So, yeah, I mean, everyone can definitely check that out. The series is called Not Your Ancestors' Civil War. We're going to get into a little bit more about what that title might mean later. But I would love it if you could just start with a summary, if that's possible, a summary of what you're writing about, and especially just
Mhm.
there's several specific transits that you talk about in relationship to the Civil War of the United States.
Mhm.
So if you can just kind of
Yeah.
lay those out for us to start.
Sure. Well, as you mentioned, and very accurately, is that Uranus, the transit of Uranus is a really big deal here. It's probably the primary transit that we can link with the Civil War. And I think that, we can sort of boil down the meaning of Uranus to two keywords, which would be rebellion and emancipation. And Uranus being a planet that really is refers to that energy, that freedom-seeking energy, and that need to break from established conditions to reassert a sense of freedom, a sense of exploration and experimentation. And so rebellion comes in because you have to that there has to be something to break from in order to create something very new. And when that established order is too set in stone or set in place, or is corrupt, the rebellion energy needs to be very strong to push against it, and can, in the case of obviously the 1860s, lead to a war. Um, but it's not as simple as saying, there's one side that's about rebellion and emancipation, and another side that's about order and control. These symbols interpenetrate, right? Or these concepts interpenetrate. So the if you think of like the Union as the established order, the United States as the established order, and the South as being the rebellion, the Southern rebellion, there's the sense of rebellion there. But then it was the North that was more radical in demanding the ending of slavery, and it was the North that sought for the emancipation of slaves, and it was the South that sought emancipation from the North, from the United States.
Hmm.
So
Hmm.
these concepts are not just like labels we can just put on one side or the other. It's all kind of bound together. Um, and then the other significant alignment or transit that I talk about in my articles is Neptune entering Aries, and how that transit, that shift of Neptune from Pisces into Aries, um, has this theme of going from almost a sense of helplessness where we see this, injustice or, problems in society are happening and we feel helpless being able to do anything about it. You think of the abolitionist movement prior to the Civil War, almost seemed like what's the point? Like why even try? But then when Neptune enters Aries, there's really this sense of action that can be taken, that'd be the Aries side of it, for the sake of a moral purpose, almost like a clarifying of a moral action that people want to take. So, and then you see the rise in these great orators of spiritual and moral purpose, whether Frederick Douglass, Lincoln himself, and the poetry of Walt Whitman, um, and you think of the Battle Hymn of the Republic, which those words written by Julia Ward Howe, that are very much bringing this kind of Aryan energy into this moral purpose, or this Neptunian compassionate purpose of freeing slaves, or yeah, bringing freedom to people who were denied it. So I think that those two planets are very important to that period, and also, of course, they're important to today because Uranus recently moved into Gemini and Neptune recently moved into Aries. They're both retrograde right now. They'll move back into uh, Taurus and Pisces respectively for a little while, but then they're coming back to Gemini and Aries. And then of course we shortly after that the United States has its Uranus return, Uranus returning to where it was when the country was founded. So these are it's very interesting, to look at to see what's going on out there and the intense division, social divisions, cultural divisions that are occurring that are start to echo a bit of what we were going through in the 1860s.
For sure. Yeah. Oh, I'll add a couple pieces. So this is maybe just food for thought because I don't really have any analysis of this, but not only, did Neptune move into Aries at the time the Civil War started, that was also just a few years after the Neptune opposition of the United States. So Neptune is at 22 degrees of Virgo in the Sibley chart. And that Neptune is at the very top of the chart. So during the Neptune opposition, and then as Neptune moves into Aries, Neptune is crossing the IC of the United States chart.
Very
And right
important.
now we have this interesting thing where Saturn and Neptune both are crossing that point. And yeah, I don't have a lot of analysis there. Definitely Saturn on the IC of the United States at 1 degree of Aries speaks a lot to the authoritarian energies that we're seeing pop up in this very like kind of shadow Aries, shadow Saturn, restrictive, blocking, shutting down kind of energy. Um, yeah, so I don't know if you have any other thoughts on that. That's just maybe something for everybody to contemplate. But the other piece that you mentioned in your articles that I hadn't thought about before was right before Uranus moves into Gemini, it squares the moon of the United States, which is at 27 degrees of Aquarius.
Mm.
And to me, you know, I don't know the history super well, like exactly when and what, what was happening when in the years leading up to the Civil War. But that really speaks to me. I feel like, especially as two white people discussing the Civil War, we want to be really careful not to deny agency to the enslaved people. It wasn't just white people coming along as the
Yeah,
saviors and like giving
absolutely.
them their freedom. And there were, one book that I love so much is The Water Dancer by Ta-Nehisi Coates, and it tells the story of an enslaved man who I think runs away and then connects with the abolitionist movement. And so there were a lot of, when I think of Uranus in Taurus squaring the moon of the United States, I think of enslaved people that were escaping, using the Underground Railroad, coming up to the North, being part of the abolitionist movement, being part of the, Union Army. And
Mhm.
yeah, I wonder what else you might have to add to that piece, because I think you've thought about that square more than I have.
Yeah. Well, as to that square of Uranus to the U.S. moon, I think it's really key, and I think um, because when we look at history, every time Uranus comes into those last degrees of Taurus, which is basically the phase we're in now and have been for at least a year, maybe a little longer, maybe 2 years even. But when Uranus is moving through those last few degrees of Taurus, we see these kinds of conflicts, social breakdowns, social conflicts, even outright aggression, and including the bombing of Pearl Harbor that precipitated the U.S. entering World War II.
Yeah.
Um, and so in the late 1850s, if we look at 1857 in particular, that's where we have the Dred Scott decision that denies Black people
Yeah.
citizenship, denies freed slaves citizenship. And then we have also Bleeding Kansas, which was the basically it was the Civil War before the Civil War. It was the people fighting and killing each other in Kansas territory to determine whether Kansas would be a free or a slave state. And that was part of the kind of social breakdown that was happening that eventually culminated in the war. There also was a financial panic in 1857 that brought a lot of conversation around whether the North promoting its idea of free labor, that well, but look, here's this economic collapse that's happening. How's your free labor really working out here? And that was kind of an argument from the South.
Right, right.
And so and that's just that's just that one year, and that was a particularly rough year. But so that Uranus squaring to the moon, if we think of the moon as representing sort of the consciousness of the people or the values that the people of the country in general hold, to have a sense of security and sense of family and connection. And Aquarius, of course, is like Uranus, has a lot to do with a sense of freedom, a sense of social justice or progressiveness or whatever. The question being, is it justice for me and my people, or is it justice for all, for everyone? And of course, the United States has been struggling with what does it mean to be a free society? What does it mean to be an Aquarian society? And we kind of go across the spectrum of being very sort of factional to very more trying to be more inclusive. Um, and so when Uranus comes and makes a square to that, it's really stimulates that attention around those issues. And you're absolutely right. I mean, there's an entire rich history of slaves, of escaped slaves, freed slaves, just the people at that time showing incredible courage to escape their situation and to speak up, against slavery. I mean, Harriet Tubman is just an amazing figure in history to facilitate the Underground Railroad and to express the kind of courage that she had to help so many people escape slavery. Yeah, and many freed slaves then joining the Union Army to fight for the Union. It's a pretty inspiring history there. So yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, that square is really interesting to contemplate at this moment because Uranus is retrograding back into that square and will be stationing direct in that square, like over the
Yes.
late fall into the winter.
Correct.
And I feel a lot of that sort of dilemma activated in this country now of like, what does freedom mean, right?
Mhm.
Like Aquarius, just like Uranus, has this association with rebelliousness and with pushing back against a status quo and not wanting to be traditional.
Mhm.
And there are many different interpretations of like what that could mean, obviously, but also I feel like, there's kind of as everything is very polarized right now, there's kind of two different sides of like what it is that needs to be rebelled against. And for some people, what is being rebelled against is kind of the traditional racist, colonialist, capitalist, patriarchal society. For
Mhm.
others, the thing that is being rebelled against is the rebellion against those things or the shift away from those things. And so I feel like that's really illustrated by that square and then the financial piece that you brought in also with Taurus
Mhm.
being part of the equation. Yeah, it'll be really interesting to see how that plays out over the next several months.
Yeah.
Yeah, so
Yeah.
I wanted to bring in the concept of Uranus as Prometheus, which
Mhm.
followers of my work are probably familiar with. I talk about this sometimes, and I think it's a really important thing to kind of be getting out there more in the astrological discourse because it really just clarifies what Uranus, the archetype and the planet in terms of astrology really is signifying and really is bringing into the picture. So this is a thesis from Richard Tarnas, an essay that he published back in 1993 at the time of the Uranus-Neptune conjunction. And he basically proposes that Uranus is a misnomer for the energy that the planet Uranus brings, and that the archetype or the figure in mythology that is really much more aligned with Uranus's energy is Prometheus. And Prometheus is the Titan who snuck up the mountain, stole fire from the gods. The gods didn't want the humans to have the fire, but Prometheus came in, he stole it, he concealed it in a stalk, he went back down the mountain, he gave it to humanity before the gods could stop him. He was severely punished for that. There's a lot of interesting pieces to the myth. We don't have to get into
Mhm.
all of that, but understanding Uranus as an energy that not only has these keywords of like you said, I think rebellion. And what was the other word you said?
Emancipation. Mhm.
Emancipation.
Yeah.
Yeah. So understanding Uranus as not just, kind of a maybe two-dimensional version of those words, but as this
Yeah.
figure that is a trickster, that causes chaos, that sets events into motion that cannot be controlled once they are out there in the world. And then we live with the repercussions of that, and that can go a lot of different ways. And a little bit later I'm going to ask you about maybe some of the darker sides of Uranus as trickster, but I would love if you could share more about in your research, maybe especially the specific figures, because you've researched the natal astrology of a lot of figures that were
Mhm.
important around the time of the Civil War, Lincoln, some of the generals, but also you mentioned Walt Whitman and I think some other like cultural figures. So anything that comes to mind as like particularly relevant or direct for that Prometheus archetype and how that was so activated in the collective at that time.
Yeah, sure, sure. And it's true that Uranus and Prometheus as a mythological figure represents rebellion and trickster energy, the stealing of fire. And but what really moves me about that Promethean connection, and by the way, I'm a big fan of Tarnas in general, but I think he did astrology a huge service by writing that essay. And then, of course, he incorporated that in his book Cosmos and Psyche. And I think it's a spot on analysis of astrological Uranus, which is really more akin to mythological Prometheus. And what's moving to me about about Prometheus as a mythology is Prometheus was thought to be, or was said to be, the creator of humanity, and or the creator of the human being. And so he spent a lot of time thinking about and designing this human creature. And then when he saw that humans were, this is kind of going back to what you were sharing about the mythology, but when he saw that humans were kind of suffering in the dark and the cold, and these animals that could catch them, and they had, because they didn't have fire. Um, he appealed to Zeus. Zeus said no, so he stole the fire and gave it to humanity. So there's this essential quality to the Promethean myth, which is humanitarianism, the
Mm.
caring of humanity, and providing fire, which of course suggests illumination. Illumination just to be able to see in the dark, but also illumination in the sense of the mind, of being able to see things you couldn't see before, and to
Mm.
see ahead of you.
Mm.
And Uranus, as and astrology as Prometheus, Uranus has that forward-looking, progressive kind of energy of trying to see ahead and see the future. And Uranus is also connected to, in astrological in astrology, Uranus is also connected to technology, the and of people, communities coming together for common purpose. And so the technology side of it is interesting, because then we have, we of course have um, Uranus being linked with technological advances of various kinds. And but then there's this kind of, it kind of can get away from us, right? Like AI, this incredible technological advancement, but we don't know where it's going to go, where it's going to take, what detrimental effects it'll have. And just like any great technological invention, it can have a very positive side and a very negative side. So I think that with Uranus, we really grapple with um, that side of it. Where okay, we can see ahead enough to create something new, and that urge to create something new is an inherent part of Uranus. But then when we create that new thing, where is it going to take us? We just don't know. If you look at the natal charts of many of the primary players of the Civil War, there are significant aspects to Uranus in those natal charts. So if we start with just a couple of examples here, we start with Abraham Lincoln. Now he was a double Aquarius. He had the Sun in Aquarius and Aquarius rising, and depending on your astrological orientation, you may say that Uranus is the ruler of Aquarius, or you may say it's the co-ruler with Saturn. But in any case, there's definitely an affinity of Uranus with Aquarius, and you mentioned this earlier. Um, they share very common qualities. And Lincoln had Mercury at a trine alignment to Uranus. He also had Uranus conjunct the North Node.
Mm.
So he really had this sort of inner drive to be this Uranian figure,
Mm.
and the trine to Mercury would reflect the sort of the brilliance of his writing his oration, think of the Gettysburg Address or
Hmm.
his debates with Stephen Douglas,
Hmm.
and how brilliantly he would present his case and how succinctly he could describe the problems with slavery, to basically say, well, if you say you can enslave these people, well, who's to stop someone else from enslaving you? And of course, he would articulate it in a very brilliant way.
Hmm.
Um, and so that's one example. Another example that really I think is really fascinating is that the two main generals of the Civil War, General Grant for the Union and General Lee for the Confederacy, both had the sun at major aspect to Uranus. For Grant, it was the sun trine Uranus, and for Lee, it was the sun square Uranus. And
Interesting.
considering that Grant fought for the Union, and just as a little bit of an aside, both Grant and Lee were, they were raised as military men within the United States military, and I believe they served together in the Mexican-American War. They knew each other, and they both were, their careers were developed from within the United States military. But then it was Lee, who has the Sun square Uranus, who rebelled against that that if you think of like the sun as representing sort of father energy,
Hmm.
and the military that sort of raised them up,
Mm.
and he was
Hmm.
the one who rebelled against, and Grant was the one who gave that energy to the United States military
Yeah.
to essentially eventually win the war.
Interesting.
So that's a really interesting comparison. And then, of course, there's Walt Whitman, whose poetry was so moving and coming out of that whole Civil War experience. And he had a grand trine with Uranus, with Mars, Moon, and Uranus. I believe all in fire signs was grand fire trine. So would be another
And
example.
Frederick Douglass, also you mentioned in your article. I can't remember what
I
specifically you said, but
No, I didn't mention him only because we don't have his chart. We don't know when he was
oh,
born, and that's a really unfortunate fact that birth dates were not recorded for slaves. I was not able to find charts for anyone that I searched for who wasn't white. So like Frederick
gotcha.
Douglass, Harriet Tubman, and there were a couple of others I was looking for, but we don't have charts for them. We don't have birth dates for them, sadly.
Yeah, so that brings in another very interesting piece that I find thinking about Uranus slash Prometheus as a trickster. And there's also, in the original mundane astrology texts, which were written before Pluto was discovered, at least a couple of them, they associate Uranus with right-wing ideologies and Neptune with left-wing ideologies. Obviously, that's a very like binary, like non-nuanced way of looking at it, but you do see in those original texts, you do see the word reactionary and right-wing associated with Uranus a lot more. And then Neptune, of course, was discovered right around the time that Karl Marx was writing, right around the time that this kind of like utopian idealistic version of socialism or communism was starting
Mhm.
to come up in the collective. And so that association, makes some sense. But I think that I think it's a really important angle of understanding to have when it comes to Uranus, that there can be this reactionary aspect of it. And we
Mhm.
have Donald Trump with Uranus conjunct the sun. We have JD Vance with Uranus trine the sun. A lot of our other very prominent right-wing figures right now have Uranus aspects as well. And
Yes.
I was also doing a little bit of research. So, like, the Ku Klux Klan started right at the end of Uranus and Gemini after the Civil War. It was in 1865. So, Uranus had just moved into Cancer. And the United States has all of these Cancer placements in its natal chart. So, as Uranus was transiting Cancer, Cancer has these themes of the land, of nativism, of protective kind of an energy, which we're seeing, an interesting shadow side of that right now as Jupiter transits all of those Cancer
Mhm.
placements in the United States chart. Also, in the early 50s, as Uranus was moving through Cancer, we had the McCarthy era and the witch hunts. So, again, that kind of a very shadow side of Uranian energy coming up. And yeah, I don't know if you have anything to add to
Yeah.
that because I don't know if that was so much that post-Civil War part was so much a part of your research, but I think that's really important to bring in that there can be this,
Hmm.
rebellion and reactionary energy that's not going in the direction of like true collective freedom. But
Hmm.
but every archetype has a shadow side, right?
Yep. Yep, for sure. And I think that's really what you're speaking to is that it may be true, and I understand where that mundane astrology perspective comes from. And it may be true that historically, uh, strong Uranus transits or Uranus cycles with other planets maybe tend to correlate with right-wing movements. But I think we can, so Uranus has this, again, this kind of emancipatory quality and energy. There's this urge to be free. And I don't know, like it can come through a left wing drive or a right wing drive, I think. And depending on how you really even classify those terms.
Hmm.
Um, I think the point is that it is reactionary and it is an energy that wants to move against something that is already established. And in the case of the post-Civil War period, with the rise of the Ku Klux Klan, well, that also led to the creation of the Department of Justice, which it was initially created to assert the law, the 13th, 14th, 15th Amendments to protect civil rights for recently freed slaves. Uh, and so the Department of Justice was created while Uranus was in Cancer, I think, conjunct the transiting North Node at the time. And so there's 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 like there's one side of it, which is the right-wing reactionary side, and then this other side of it that is reacting to that.
Hmm.
And so and then with respect to you mentioned McCarthy, and so McCarthy, he failed in disgrace, and
Hmm.
um,
Hmm.
so again, he came out in this very reactionary way, but then there was a reaction against him,
Hmm.
and I think there's also an interesting point just to draw a correlation between, we're talking about the Civil War, and we just mentioned McCarthyism, is that McCarthy really came into his power while Saturn was at a square to Uranus. And the Civil War started with Saturn at
Right.
square
That's
to
another
Uranus.
interesting transit that you mentioned.
Yeah, and then there's January 6th, 2021, storming of the Capitol, which happened with
Yeah.
Saturn square to Uranus with Mars conjunct Uranus. So Uranus and
Yes.
Mars were squaring Saturn. Same aspect pattern was happening when the Civil War started. Mars, Uranus squaring Saturn. So, there's just like
Yeah.
some, again, just the echoes there that
Yeah.
are really
Yeah.
interesting. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think it really speaks to the Gemini Uranus placement in the United States natal chart that there is this back and forth because, we know that like
That's a good point.
after losing the Civil War, the South did not just like accept its fate. And there were these years of Reconstruction that were like 10 to
Yeah.
15 years after the Civil War, where so many Black people came into government. They started building towns, they started establishing markets for themselves, they started building schools, they started establishing all kinds of aspects of society for themselves. And then there was, what is called like the redemption. And I remember that from my high school history textbook, which is like such a kind of shameful, horrific name even for it. But there was
Mm.
this period after that where there was just this horrible, violent pushback from
Yeah.
the white people in the South who didn't want that to happen. And then, that led to the creation of Jim Crow and
Yeah.
lots of other like disenfranchisement efforts, lots of other direct violence to prevent Black people from really living out their freedom. And, all credit to the freedom fighters who stood up against that in a really, really beautiful manifestation of Uranian energy. And to this day, keep
Yeah.
pushing back against that piece. But I feel like that Uranus and Gemini in the United States natal chart speaks to this kind of inherent division in the
Yeah.
country that
Yeah.
maybe kind of sort of dips back under the surface if you're privileged enough to not have to deal with it all the
Yeah.
time. But especially when Uranus comes back around for these Uranus returns, it resurfaces and becomes very obvious again.
Yeah. I think that's a great point. A great, that kind of Geminian way of polarizing one way and then another, and then just seeing conflicts between polarized ideologies. And I think what that ultimately, and if we really zoom out, I think it's human consciousness struggling with um, how to take these polarized ideals and create something new that is more inclusive. And I'm someone who has the mindset that human consciousness is in a process of evolution and that we do make advances. There are regressions that require revisiting old conflicts.
Hmm.
Um, but in order to generate a new possibility for the future, and to become more awakened, to become more illuminated, so to speak. And so, yeah, that sort of tragic period. I mean, really, that period after the Civil War, there was this um, emphasis to try and incorporate freed slaves, black people into society and give them support their civil rights. And then that was, just fought against, and the North pulled out of it, just like, okay, and then
Right,
allowed the southern states back
right,
into the government,
right.
and
And that's also
without,
that division there, that Gemini and division.
yeah. But all of that, really, I mean, I think hinges on the assassination of Lincoln, because Andrew
Mm,
Johnson
mm,
was basically a Southern Democrat, or had affinity. I think he was a Democrat actually, and back then the Democrats were the
yeah,
pro-slavery party, and
yeah.
so
What
he
year
was
was Lincoln assassinated?
1865,
Oh, okay.
just after,
Oh,
just
yeah,
like
yeah.
5 days after the surrender at Appomattox. Yeah.
Oh,
So.
wild.
So then Andrew Johnson was like, okay, let's just bring these southern states back in, and made it really easy, and did not stand as a leader in the way Lincoln did for these ideals. So the primary point being that the country really kind of changed direction when Andrew Johnson became president, and of course there were members of Congress, the so-called radical Republicans, who were the ones who were interested in enforcing civil rights for the freed slaves. They were in they tried to impeach Johnson, but they didn't succeed. So so that's like it's very Uranian, right? From an astrological perspective, that the country seemed to be moving in a certain direction with Lincoln as president. Suddenly he's assassinated, and it's like an inflection point. The country is now moving in a totally different direction.
Yeah. Yeah, right. Also very Uranian.
Yep.
So to start to finish up, I think the title that you chose for your article series is very interesting. You called it Not Your Ancestors' Civil War.
Yeah.
And I'm just going to put my own little interpretation of that in, or just my own kind of thoughts on that subject. So in my anti-racist work, a big piece that has landed for me is that a big important part of anti-racist work for white people is to get to know your ancestors and to know if they were slaveholders and to know if they
Mhm.
fought in the Civil War. And the reason that's so important is not just so you can be guilty and shameful about it and repent or whatever. There's a lot of layers to ancestral healing, and there's like a very spiritual aspect to actually getting to know the specifics of who your ancestors were and how they lived and what opinions they held and how their nervous systems were wired. But I believe that through that process, we as white people can write the history that we are living out now in a different way. And I have this experience kind of often where I tell people that I write about astrology and politics and that I track astrology as it relates to, I usually say something along the lines of the crazy things that are happening in the world today or something like that. And I get this response often where people will say, "Oh, I hope there's something good coming for us."
Hmm.
And I always say, or I don't always because it depends on the context of the situation, but in general, my response to that is that's not what astrology is about. Astrology is not here to predict what's going to happen. It does not have that capacity to just like tell us what's coming. Astrology is useful because we can use it to anticipate what's coming. We can use it as a map of the territory that we're moving into, and we can see what the energies are. We can see what the timelines are. And hopefully, we can use it as one of many, many tools to write things or manifest things or create things in a less bad way, in a way that creates less suffering instead of more, in a way that moves us towards true freedom and emancipation instead of away from it. So you told me that you chose that title mostly because you see some hopeful aspects in the astrology coming up that make you think that maybe we won't go into some kind of a civil war this time around, or maybe there will be some more, concrete movement towards justice. So I was wondering if you could share more about that, whatever it is that you see that can give us some hopeful energies and timelines to work with here and help us anticipate what we're moving into.
Sure, sure. And to be clear, just to preface what I say is that yes, I want to agree with you that astrology is not about, making these concrete predictions and saying what's going to happen or use it as a way to as a kind of palliative, like, oh, it's all going to be okay, and to pretend that we don't have real responsibility in whatever takes place. So, you know, the astrological symbols are referring to archetypal dynamics. Uh, so they're qualitative, and they can manifest, in probably an infinite number of ways, but they're going to manifest with this archetypal quality that is going to be consistent with the astrological map. But it is up to us human beings to make the choices, to use our free will to make the choices
Yes.
that will help move humanity as a whole into a more positive expression of those archetypal dynamics. Um, my point about feeling a bit more encouraged is first of all, not to, I mean, if you're a Gazan right now, you're how can any of us really relate to what some people in the world are going through right now? And they're going through something really, really terrible that we can't sugarcoat. And so like when we talk about feeling encouraged about the future, it's not to say that people aren't suffering. Um, the question on my mind is, and part of why I named the article the way I did, is that while we are moving into these similar archetypal dynamics, the 2020s are not the 1860s. And that, hopefully, and I think humanity has grown up a little bit since then,
At least a
despite,
little.
yeah, just a little bit. We've inched forward. Despite a lot of what we're seeing today. But also, just to look at the astrological picture, there's, I mentioned earlier that I mentioned earlier that there was that alignment of Saturn, Uranus, and Mars at the start of the Civil War. That same alignment occurred in 2021. And now, so we've moved through that same archetypal dynamic. It did not become an all-out war, although
Right,
it's a culture war. But
right.
and so and then as we look forward into the coming years, we of course have the outer planet alignment, right, of Uranus trine Pluto sextile to Neptune. And I'm not one to say that trines are good, squares are bad, but to say that that these energies are in a pattern that is much more harmonious and flowing together versus that like conflictual square or oppositional dynamics.
Yeah.
Um, and and also I'm looking ahead to the Saturn-Uranus conjunction of 2032, which is at a trine to the moon of the United States. So when Uranus trines the US moon, Saturn joins it there. And the United States seems to be connected to the Saturn-Uranus cycle. Um, it seems, whether we're talking about the Saturn-Uranus square that kicked off the Civil War or that kicked off the Depression, the economic cycle of the United States seems to be correlated to the Saturn-Uranus cycle. Saturn-Uranus conjunctions tend to correlate with points of renewal within the economic system, where there's we begin to see a kind of rebuilding after a collapse or a crisis. So the fact that that conjunction happens in that alignment to the U.S. moon, I think, is encouraging. Um,
Hmm.
but that we still, and that's just one factor, and we still want to. I mean, to your point about looking at our ancestral lineage and, did our ancestors contribute to whatever problems, whether it was contributing to slavery or contributing to persecution or genocide of the Native Americans or any wars that were fought, war just being a traumatic experience. We carry that. I mean, I believe this, and I think there's even some science to back this up, that we carry that energy, the ancestral consciousness, somewhere, deep in our subconscious or unconscious. And
Hmm.
so part of our work as spiritual people, or part of what is our spiritual work, is to look deep within our own consciousness and to unearth some of that, and to really question, where does that live in me, and how can I work with it to affect a healing of whatever I can, whatever positive energy or positive growth I can contribute to the collective. And I think like being an astrologer and putting your creative work out there, and really having that heart-centered focus is part of the work.
Mm. Yeah, and I just have to add, I'm surprised it's taken me this long to bring in the United States Pluto return, but
Yes, yes.
as dark as that transit is, and as dark as I've kind of made it seem in all the ways that I've talked about it, there are some parts of that that also give me a lot of hope. And in particular, there's the fact of the Pluto return bringing all of this history out into the mainstream consciousness in a way that it has never existed before. And yes, there's still plenty of people trying to shut it down, and the backlash, right, against, what is taught in schools and this kind of thing is also part of the United States Pluto return, but there is no shutting that Pandora's box. There is no putting the
Yeah.
helm of Hades back onto Pluto. Like the mainstream conversation around
Yeah.
this country's history has changed so dramatically. And that is what would have to happen for there to be
Hmm.
healing, right? There could
Absolutely.
never be healing, and there could never be, you know, a manifestation of the United States Uranus return or whatever astrological aspects, but there could never be a continuation of this country's history that is truly healing and truly
Hmm.
moving towards justice without that massive unearthing and the
I agree.
conversation around what it means that our foundations are so rotten. So, that piece, the way that the discourse has changed, even since I started talking about the Pluto return in 2018, the discourse has changed so dramatically. And that gives me a lot of hope. And it's also kind of long term, but I have always thought about Pluto conjunct the United States moon, which doesn't happen until like the end of the 2030s. But, I think the United States moon has a lot of connection to the ideals that are in the Declaration of Independence and in the Constitution of the United States. And whatever the intentions were of the founding fathers, who really only intended those ideals to be for landowning Christian white men, still that moon is symbolic of more than just how
Yeah.
they even conceived of those ideals. And so if we move into a period of ongoing turmoil, which judging by history of many countries, not just us, like we
Yeah.
are continuing to move in that direction. But I think that that transit could be a period where there is a rebirth of those ideals. And if we move into a, decade long constitutional crisis, that could be a period where something really new emerges and a new kind of core or heart of what this country is about could start to take shape around that time.
Yeah. Yeah, yeah, and I think that it's so important to remain conscious of where we, as it, individually can polarize, towards fear or hate or resentment or, it's all their fault, whoever they might be, and to continue, with humility to kind of till the soil of understanding within ourselves to like, well, you know. I am not going to, there are certain like moral principles that we want to hold and that we don't want to put aside. At the same time, we need to be able and willing to seek to understand those who say things that we deeply disagree with. And that's really hard to do. And it's not about like trying to deeply understand somebody doesn't mean you adopt their point of view.
Yeah.
Simply, it's an attempt to understand where they're coming from, why they believe what they believe, and we need to do that work in order to you know ultimately so that we can all work together to create a future that is more inclusive and that can bring people together instead of splitting everyone apart. And because there's a lot of sort of social division that is splitting people. There's this kind of trope right now of it's not left versus right, it's top versus bottom, right? And I think there's a certain truth to that forces that are aligning, that are actively trying to keep division, create more division, to keep us, divided, so we're easier to conquer. And so it's really important to understand each other so that we can be united in, really dealing with where is the corruption and and who needs to be held accountable and how do we deal with this and how do we move forward and create a future that helps to prevent this kind of crisis from happening again, or at least not be as bad.
Yeah. Yeah, well, thank you. This has been a fascinating conversation. I'm always, my mind is always blown by how much astrology there is to
So much, right?
study
Yeah,
when it comes
never
to
ends.
anything, any event in history, even just what we're going through now. There's so many layers of it, and yeah, it's great to chat with you and hear about these deeper pieces of that particular transformational time in history. So to finish up, do you have anything you want to plug or share? You want to tell people where to find you or how to connect with you? You're not on social media, right?
Yeah, I've kind of avoided social media. I am on Facebook, and Soul Rise Astrology, Soulrise Astrology. You can find me there. You can I have a website, soulriseastrology.com. If people are interested, you can sign up on my mailing list. I post two to three or maybe four emails a month, about articles that I've written or events that I'm taking part in or giving. And so that's really the best way to contact me. There's a contact form there. I also offer natal readings. People want to reach out for a reading, they can do so through my website as well.
Do you do anything in person in Nashville?
I do actually. There's a Jungian-based meetup group here that I occasionally give presentations for. I also give presentations. There are a couple of um, locations around town where I've given presentations for like spiritual communities and so forth. And I also occasionally give online presentations for the Young Center in Evanston, which is in the Chicago area. And sometimes, well, I'm hoping soon to start giving just my own presentations just online on Zoom. Um, so yeah.
Cool. Yeah, there might be some people who are local to you who would see this. So
Yeah,
that'd
which
be
would be
cool if
great.
you could
Yeah, I
connect.
hope they'll reach out. I'll be glad to meet them and also I just want to say, I think you've done a great job with your podcast, and it's helped inspire me to maybe get my own podcast off the ground. We'll see when that happens, but yeah, hopefully
Awesome.
soon.
Well, thank you so much, Brian.
Thank you.